Mr. President, I'm very touched by your opening remarks because I spend a good bit of my time in Washington trying to explain the Bush administration, which is a gigantic task. And I can't imagine who would be more horrified, whether it be President Bush or me, at the thought that I might be defending the Bush administration. Let me say that that's not my intent. But I do think it's important to understand that President Bush does not subscribe to Marxist superstructures. His idea was exactly the opposite, in that in liberating the individuals would build democratic structures.
Yes, you're right, but I didn't say that he was a classical Marxist. I said that he thought that if he could change part of the reality, the other part of the reality will change automatically. Only that.
But as we've seen, reality has changed President Bush much more than vice versa. And I think many people think for the better. The second point that I wanted to follow up on in your remarks was that the idea that a crisis like that of the Russian invasion of Georgia brings about mechanisms that put themselves en marche to solve the problem. Many of us saw, in fact, the opposite lesson from this, in that this crisis required an individual who is going to be here in a little while to speak to us, to stand up and act really without the mechanisms, to do it on an individual basis. But that may be a very particular American point of view, even if it was a French president, is the individual that I'm talking about, of course.
Please. I say that I accept your remark. And when I spoke of mechanism, I didn't think of a mechanism which is institutional, but something is moving. And in this case, the French president of the European Community decided to act, and he acted as president of the European Community because the European Community feels that they are responsible for peace in this part of the world, in the world in general, in parts of the world. There is a mechanism. Without the European Community, even the French president, and we see how all his qualities, wouldn't have been able to act with such efficiencies in this crisis.
I think it's a good subject for Thierry's next conference, the individual versus the mechanism or the institution. But speaking of institutions, it gives me a chance to pursue Stéphane's point about what can Switzerland's contribution be to global governance, particularly since he started on the issue of banking secrecy. Let me pursue another part of the Swiss image, which is to stand apart, to be neutral. We live in an era when the ideology of states, the conflict of states, has taken a back seat to what the Kenyan Prime Minister described to us the other day as an ideological struggle for the minds of the young in the world. And I think there he was talking particularly about the conflict within Islam between extremist and moderate mainstream Islamicists, but in general, between those who would use violence for extremist purposes and those who oppose that. What contribution can neutrality make to such a struggle today?
First of all, neutrality, Swiss neutrality, is not ideologic. I think during the past century, Swiss clearly was on the side of democratic people when it was facing fascism, Nazism. It was on the side of freedom when Swiss fought communism. There was no hesitation from our part. Back then, there is no ideologic neutrality. Neutrality is the will to not take one side or the other of the two warriors, if I may say so, two parties at war. This is much more technical, neutrality. It's not ideological, it's not being indifferent to the world. Neutrality, as was described, as was enforced by historical circumstances by big powers at the beginning of the century in the Alps, neutrality became the Swiss neutrality, this political neutrality. We take part in all international organizations. The UN is backed by Switzerland, and Switzerland participates in these actions, participates in Bretton Woods. We take part in the Human Rights Council. We are amongst all of these organizations. We talked about the risk of civilization conflict of civilization. First of all, I disagree with the term conflict of civilization. I think there are cultures that meet, sometimes clash, but there shouldn't be conflicts of civilization. So, there's no reason to be neutral. There are no two parties fighting. Terrorism is a completely different problem. There is no neutrality against terrorism. You have to fight it. It's a basic precondition for the survival of mankind. Bank secrecy, that's another problem. It's got nothing to do with the present crisis. It doesn't prevent transparency when it comes to fighting against criminal organizations. Switzerland indeed takes part in all police operations against money laundering, etc. The bank secrecy, from that point of view, is in keeping with the ideal standards of the most demanding international life. What can do neutral Switzerland? Well, because we know it won't take part in an armed conflict, it can at some point offer something that is offered by a country that has no hidden agenda, like they say. We don't have any hidden agenda. We don't have any ambitions for power. We are ambitious as a country, but no ambition for power. And several times we managed to... I was in Lebanon last week, for instance. The present president is making huge efforts. I hope he'll be successful to bring together various communities. Well, a few years back, Switzerland organized meetings, forums, during totally opposed factions in Switzerland. And Switzerland has no interest in Lebanon, except for the fact that Lebanon works well. So we play our role, even if it's not very significant, but few countries can play this kind of a role. Norway is one, maybe, but we can play that role. There is no hidden agenda. We're here to try and send messages. We're here to try to convey ideas between countries which otherwise might fight.